Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. Those of you who have been listening to the Foxed Page really for any amount of time probably know that my very favorite writer of all time is Virginia Woolf. I was introduced to her when I was a senior in high school by an English teacher who was very ambitious and had a lot of faith in us. And that was a time when I was not reading well. I mean, I was reading avidly, but literally it was like almost all Danielle Steele. Punctuated, of course, by what the high school was making us read, which was literally like Crime and Punishment. Crime and Punishment did not speak to me, but To the Lighthouse absolutely did. I felt like someone had gotten inside my brain and was able to tell exactly how I thought. I came to Mrs. Dalloway a little bit later, which I think is very appropriate. Mrs. Dalloway was published in 1925 and To the Lighthouse in 1927, so I read them out of order. But I think for many people, the younger person's book is To the Lighthouse. It's about a mother figure. It's about children in many ways. It's certainly about the loss of childhood. All of that is a little more germane than Mrs. Dalloway. As I've grown older, however, Mrs. Dalloway has taken such a large place in my heart. This is the 100th anniversary of the publication of the novel. Clarissa Dalloway is turning 151. And for a long time now, she has been someone who I have related to so strongly. So today's conversation is going to be a little bit different. I'm just going to be kind of wide-ranging about what we are going to talk about. We will definitely be looking at the prose. We'll look at stream of consciousness. We're going to take a close look at the title. We're going to look at sexuality in the novel, which I think is something that tends to get kind of glossed over. And we're going to take a very close look at the most amazing passage about phallic symbols that I have ever read in all of literature. We'll start with a very brief bio of Virginia Woolf and a very brief conversation or a very brief description of modernism, and then we're going to dive right into this incredible text. Very quick Virginia Woolf bio, just to get us situated. She was born in 1882. This is the heart of the Victorian era when women are seen as ornamental. They're seen as very weak and frail, all of which will have a huge impact on her. She was in a blended family. Her mother had been married before, and as had her father. Both of them had children from former marriages. Both of them had spouses who died. It is largely believed that her two older stepbrothers, at least one of them, was sexually abusive to her as a child. But she grew up in a very intellectual household, and although lots of her feelings about childhood were very positive, she suffered a whole series of losses when she was 13, starting when she was 13. Her mother died when she was 13. She was very close with her mother. Then her half-sister Stella, who she was very close with, died when she was 15. She lost her brother Toby, who was very beloved to her, when she was 18 years old, and her father died not long after that. She grew up in the Kensington area of London, loved London. I was there last year and was able to actually go and look at the house where she lived as a young child. If you're on the YouTube, I'll go ahead and show some pictures of that. But when she started losing members of her family, she and her sister, as it is, I think, very well known, moved to Bloomsbury and became part of a group of people who were all very artistic. Lots of them were writers, there were painters. All of these people were very artistic and very bohemian in the sense that a lot of people were having different affairs with both people's husbands and wives. We had a lot of queer stuff happening. Virginia married Leonard Woolf in 1912, and they had a very interesting relationship. I think a lot of times people discount the importance of Leonard Woolf. Their relationship was not super sexually passionate, but he was an incredible support to her. And for the most part, it seemed like a very positive union. She also had a relationship with Vita Sackville West, and was fairly upfront about the fact that she was a Sapphist. So a Sapphist being another word for being gay, coming from the poet Sappho. And as one might expect from all of this loss and from someone who was a complicated person in terms of her emotions and her thoughts, she suffered a bunch of bouts of what they were calling at the time a nervous disorder. And because it was the Victorian era and they believed in the Victorian rest cure, the idea was that they would kind of have you lie down in a dark room somewhere and not read and not see anyone and just be in your brain. For her, that was not excellent. So she, throughout her life, would have these experiences of being really depressed and despairing. She did try to take her life a couple of times. And then in 1941, just as the war was really heating up, and she was really despairing over the fact that we were going to have another huge global catastrophe, just like the First World War, she did kill herself by filling her pockets with rocks and wading into the river Ouse. The idea of the war is actually a very good segue into this idea of modernism. So she is one of the foremost practitioners, or like really the savants of this era. So the modernist movement came at the beginning of the 20th century, very end of the 19th century, so late 1800s into the 20th century. And in the past, when I've talked about it, I've really focused on the war. But during this reading, I was really thinking about this as a city novel, a novel that's really in many ways like a love letter to London. And that just reminded me that modernism was not just a result of the First World War, but really a result of industrialization, industrial revolution. I'm remembering this from like 8th grade, US history, but I have in my mind it's 1900. But there was this rapid sense of change and of things really in many ways not becoming better. Even in Mrs. Dalloway, we see it. We see motor cars, we see advertising, we see airplanes. And I'm not going to go into a long description of the realist novel, which was really the predominant novel all the way up until modernism. So you can just think of like John Steinbeck or Henry James or Tolstoy or Madame Bovary. All of those are big fat books with an omniscient narrator and a very clear sense of plot, and time is linear, and it is describing people from the outside. When we have industrialization, when we have the First World War, when we have a real crisis in how to think about humanity, all of those old modes of telling stories seemed kind of outdated. So the whole idea with this modernist movement was make it new. That was kind of their slogan. It was Ezra Pound who said that. We have people like T.S. Eliot, we have James, we have Beckett. Not James, we have Joyce. We have James Joyce. But in my mind, Virginia Woolf really is the person who most embodies this modernism. And one of the hallmarks of it is that we are speaking about people's interiority. Instead of describing things from the outside, she is inside the brains of many people. And when I say many people, she's, predominantly in one or two characters in any given work, but she's moving in and out of everyone's consciousness in a way that was totally radical. So in addition to this stream of consciousness, which is what we have come to call her style, we also had novels that were fragmented, novels where plot is no longer as important. And we have a lot of experimentation. I mean, think of Ulysses as kind of the ultimate example of that. And E.M. Forster has this amazing essay that he wrote about modernism, where he talks about Virginia Woolf as someone who's not talking about what someone's thinking, but is talking about how they are thinking, which is just a radical way to think about it. This is someone who is really deeply entering into the minds of people, not just telling us what their ideas are. Importantly, it also was the time we have Freud, we have the idea of the subconscious, we have the idea of all of these different ways to think about the brain. All of that is also happening at the same time. So now we're going to dive into the book itself. If you are here to become a better reader, my simple advice is just to pay attention. And one of the things you might want to stop and really examine for a moment is the title of a book. It seems totally obvious when you say it, but I think a lot of us, myself included, you can kind of gloss over that title in your excitement to get to the text itself. But it is really important, especially in a classic like this that is so complex in so many ways. It really behooves you to slow down and take a look at the title. So in this case, we have this book called Mrs. Dalloway. In some ways, this feels very traditional in the sense that we have a woman who is a married woman. There's a fair amount of emphasis on the fact that she is married. So in that idea of Mrs. Dalloway, we have the idea also of a Mr. Dalloway. We have the presence of the patriarchy and social conventions, even though it's not called the Dalloways or Mr. Dalloway. We also have the sense of her as being a bit older. She seems like someone, because we are really putting emphasis on the Mrs. part, she seems like someone who might be slightly matronly. This is not going to be a dramatic love story about someone who is very young and who is searching for love and experiencing heartache. This is someone who is married, and in many ways, Virginia Woolf is leading with that marriage. But the other thing that it is doing, which is radical, is it's telling us that it is going to be a woman who is at the heart of this novel. And that is a very radical thing to think about. We are really going to hear, the direct thoughts and the thought patterns and how a woman thinks. And it is written by a woman. So all of this is important and revolutionary. And it's really important to note that this book is a result of a kind of a long process of writing. So There was a very early version of this where Clarissa Dalloway is the only, there is no Septimus Warren Smith. We only had Clarissa Dalloway. And at the end, it is she who takes her life. So we have this idea of this existence of a manuscript that in many ways was kind of a blueprint for this. Then we have a series of these Mrs. Dalloway stories that eventually become this book. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is we have Mrs. Dalloway as the title, and then we also have Mrs. Dalloway as the first two words of the book. We're going to dive in here. We're going to read the first two very short paragraphs and the very beginning of the third. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. So sure enough, we have this emphasis on the domestic. But what's important here is right in the beginning, we have the idea of her voice. We have Mrs. Dalloway said. And what she is saying is that she wants to do something herself. So we see this woman right from the start as independent, even though her marriage is really sort of front and center. And the movement from that very brief first sentence into the second paragraph is masterful. Here's what we have in the second paragraph. Actually, I'm going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read the first and second together. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. For Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. So the thing I want to draw your attention to here is that we're immediately entering into the mind of Mrs. Dalloway. We have the sense of her voice as having told someone, maybe Lucy, I'm going to buy the flowers myself. And then we enter into her mind. And what she's thinking about is all of the work that her maid has to do that day. And there's no gloss for it. There's no frame. We simply move into this, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. So in the very beginning here, we're a little unmoored. We have Mrs. Dalloway certainly at the center. And then we have the introduction of Lucy and a few other things. And then Woolf reminds us again that we are in fact in the mind of Clarissa Dalloway, and very explicitly. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning. And this is very important because here we have Clarissa introduced right in the middle of this second paragraph, where it's very early, we're like 5 lines into the novel. And this is the first of many examples where we will have her referred to as Mrs. Dalloway and also as Clarissa Dalloway. And one of the most miraculous things about this book is that it is a book about this one woman, Mrs. Dalloway, but it is so much more than that. Stream of consciousness is known for sort of dilating a moment. We will have, we'll have Clarissa Dalloway walking out of her house, and then we'll have all of these thoughts that are going through her head. And part and parcel with those thoughts is often many memories, many worries. Essentially, during the course of this afternoon, we just are following her as she is doing her errands, and yet a whole world opens up to us. And one of the things that I like very best about that is we see so many versions of Clarissa Dalloway. And every time I come back to this book, I find a really different emphasis depending on where I am in my life, depending on my concerns or my priorities at the time. And it is uncanny to me how often we can find different things even in Clarissa Dalloway herself. So we see her as a wife at the very beginning. Then when she walks out the door and she has this thought, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. So right away, we have the sense she is thinking of this beautiful morning as we're being transported, as she is in that moment, to the beach and to children. So you have this sense of her possibly as a mother, at the beach with her children and seeing this morning that is delighting her children. But you also, and in my mind, it feels like she is reverting in some ways to childhood. The stepping out of her place into presumably the sunshine brings her back to this idea of what childhood beaches would have felt like. And that is one of our first indications of all of the different versions of Clarissa that we are going to see. We see her, and in many ways, this is a book about regrets. It's about things that did not come to fruition. So one of the main points throughout the book, of course, is that we have Mrs. Dalloway's former love, Peter Walsh, and her future did not carry on with that man. He, in fact, has just come back from India. So their paths really had diverged. She did instead marry Mr. Dalloway. We're going to take a very close look at the interactions between Mrs. Dalloway and Peter Walsh, because that is that unbelievably great scene that has so much sexual innuendo. And this is not a book where we have like a lot of passion or a lot of like unbridled passion. There's not a lot of physical stuff that is happening, but you do have this sense of the connection between the two of them. So we have this idea of Mrs. Dalloway as a young person who was very caught up in a romantic experience. even as we have her as someone who is married to like this cabinet minister. I think that's, or like a member of parliament. He's some sort of conservative guy. There's one description of him about how simple he is. He feels very much like kind of a simpleton, but in many ways she is happy with her life. So we see her as a married woman. We also see her as someone who used to be in love with a girlfriend of hers, Sally Seton. And that is another absolutely incredible passage of sexuality that we are going to see. Sally Seton, I'm saying Seton, but I'm wondering if it's Seton. It's Seton, but I have recently watched The Buccaneers, and there's someone named Seton in there, so now I'm thinking maybe I should be saying Seton. But the revolutionary thing about Sally Seton, the thing that I always remember is that at one point when she and Clarissa were young women, Sally had forgotten her sponge bag. And so she went kind of chasing down a hallway naked. And this was, to Clarissa, this was an absolutely like revolutionary thing to do because it was so daring. And this, again, is not a thing where we had like some full-blown gay relationship between Clarissa and Sally, but we really sink into this idea of her infatuation and her admiration for Sally Seton. Then of course Sally shows up, and now she is like the mother of 5 boys, and her life has moved in an entirely different direction. So we see all of these different versions of Mrs. Dalloway, and each one of these things opens up. I mean, it's such a delightful book to read because for ourselves, it gets you back in touch with maybe someone you were infatuated with, someone of any gender. There are also moments where Mrs. Dalloway is very concerned with her daughter Elizabeth, and certainly with Elizabeth's tutor. And this is a really interesting look at a relationship of a young woman being sort of infatuated with another woman. In this case, the tutor, she's kind of like a dried up old, like spinstery type who is very threatening in many ways to Clarissa because she's the opposite. She's someone who has dedicated herself to learning. She's someone who's very austere. She's certainly not someone who would have a big party with flowers. And so in this case, we see Mrs. Dalloway as a mother who is concerned about her child's future and who's doing all sorts of projecting onto her child. And we don't see Richard Dalloway until much later in the book, but we do, in fact, see her as a wife in addition to all of these other things. We see her at different times where she's really doubting herself. Her husband has been to lunch with a woman who's very powerful in the government. She feels a lot of jealousy. It's a deceivingly simple book. I mean, I think people all the time say, like, the problem with Virginia Woolf is nothing happens. And my sense is, like, everything is happening. And in many ways, it's all kind of held within this one character. And I love the way that Virginia Woolf has really focused our attention with the title. So I've just gotten through telling you that Mrs. Dalloway, in many ways, well, she is really very much the heart of the novel. That really is where we are meant to focus our attention. But I would be completely remiss if I did not, at this point, talk about Septimus Warren Smith. So this is someone who they don't meet in the book. The two of them, they pass each other at one point, and they're seeing the same things at certain times. That in many ways, they're kind of inhabiting the same space and time. Septimus Warren Smith is someone who fought in the First World War and is really having a terrible time with what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe you would call it, I think you call it shell shock back in the day, maybe battle fatigue, something like that. So he is in London, and in part to see doctors in order to get some help, and he's there with his wife Lucrezia. What's important to note is that Septimus Warren Smith, in many ways, is both kind of a foil and a twin for Mrs. Dalloway. So you'll recall that in the first version of this book, it was Mrs. Dalloway who takes her own life at the end. In this case, it is Septimus Warren Smith who does, which is important because it's clearly a condemnation of the effect of the First World War. Virginia Woolf was very critical of the war. She had very strong political convictions. And this absolutely was meant to be kind of an expose about how difficult life was for many people returning from the First World War. And what's incredible is talk about slowing down, you really have to slow down. But if you really slow down and start looking at the passages with Septimus Warren Smith, you start to notice that there are all of these things that tie the two of them together. They both at different points quote Shakespeare. They both have all of these thoughts about mortality. In some ways, they could not be more different. But if you look hard, you can see all of these overlapping things. And that pairing is crucial. It gives a huge amount of gravitas to the novel in general. My sense is that just Clarissa's party and just what is happening among the people in her milieu would have been entirely interesting enough. But when you add on this whole other element that is so well structured together with Mrs. Dalloway's errands and her party, it just turns the novel into something entirely else, something that is a very important statement. And when we have, as we are entering into the mind of Mrs. Dalloway and the mind of Septimus Warren Smith, part of the reason each of them seems so well drawn is because we have them as contrasts to one another. And I want to take a moment here just to read a little bit of the prose, just so you can, if you haven't read the book for a while, you can really have this idea of stream of consciousness in your mind as we are moving through. I could open to almost any passage here and we would have it, but I've marked this one on page 8. I really like this one because we're hearing a lot about Peter Walsh, but we're really having a sense of what Mrs. Dalloway is thinking, but also how she is thinking it. And we also have this sense of her as thinking while things are happening around her. We're very anchored in the day in some ways, but we also are having these very small moments when she's walking out the door, or in this case, she's getting to a gate. And these moments are dilated in a way that is hugely interesting and also very formally inventive. So in the top part of this, she is thinking about Peter Walsh on page 8. But with Peter, everything had to be shared, everything gone into, and it was intolerable. And when it came to that scene in the little garden by the fountain, she had to break with him, or they would have been destroyed, both of them ruined. She was convinced, though she had borne about with her for years, like an arrow sticking in her heart, the grief, the anguish, and then the horror of the moment when someone told her at a concert that he had married a woman met on the boat going to India. Never should she forget all that. Cold, heartless, a prude, he called her. Never could she understand how he cared. But those Indian women did, presumably. Silly, pretty, flimsy nincompoops, and she wasted her pity. For he was quite happy, he assured her, perfectly happy. Though he had never done a thing they had talked of, his whole life had been a failure. It made her angry still. So this is just, this just really reminds you of the depth of all of this prose. She's gone through such an enormous thing here. She's remembering when the two of them sort of broke off their infatuation with each other by the fountain. So you see this kind of jealousy. But what's fascinating to me is we are really right with her. She's getting in touch with her anger and some of her jealousy. So she's having all of these thoughts as she's moving through, and regrets even on the part of Peter that they had all of these plans and that they didn't come to fruition. So she says, his whole life had been a failure. It made her angry still. She had reached the park gates. She stood for a moment, looking at the omnibuses in Piccadilly. So that's just these two sentences that are breaking up these paragraphs of thinking, but we have her situated in London, and then we move on. She would not say of anyone in the world now that they were this or were that. She felt very young, at the same time unspeakably aged. She sliced like a knife through everything, at the same time was outside, looking on. She had a perpetual sense, as she watched the taxicabs, of being out, far out to sea and alone. She always had the feeling that it was very, very dangerous to live even one day. For anyone who thinks that this is a trifle about some woman going out to buy flowers for a party, take a look at that passage. And one of the things that Woolf does so well is she'll do that kind of thinking for a number of different people all together. So she'll move from the mind of one person to the next. And I want to look at a passage here. It's fairly early in the book. This is when we have Lucrezia. So she's married to Septimus Warren Smith, and they are together at Regent's Park. And she's really, she's trying to make him feel better because he is someone who is suffering a real breakdown. So on page 21, we have this. Lucrezia Warren Smith, Lucretia? I'm not sure exactly how we're meant to be pronouncing that. Probably Lucretia. Lucretia Warren Smith, sitting by her husband's side on a seat in Regent's Park in the Broad Walk, looked up. Look, Septimus, she cried. For Dr. Holmes had told her to make her husband, who had nothing whatever seriously the matter with him, but was a little out of sorts, take an interest in things outside himself. Very importantly there, the part that was in parentheses, I hope you could hear my voice modulating, so you had the parentheses, that is the words of Dr. Holmes saying to her, oh, there's nothing seriously wrong with him, he's just a little out of sorts. Doctors really do not come off well in this book, and this is a very good example of that. So she has these words of the doctor in her mind, and she's encouraging him, she says, look, she wants to kind of draw him out and anchor him in the real world. So, thought Septimus, looking up, they are signaling to me. Importantly, what they are seeing, what she's telling him to look at, is an airplane, and it's writing something in the sky. This part is so beautiful. Turns out that it's an advertisement, which is a very like 20th century thing. The idea of capitalism, the idea of consumerism, all of this is a very new kind of phenomenon, and certainly airplanes that are writing things would have been noted by everyone. And one of the most beautiful things is that we have many different characters who are all seeing this happen. The fact that everyone is experiencing the same thing and they're all looking up into the sky provides a kind of community among them that is so elegant and speaks, at the same time it's speaking of community, it's also speaking of the atomization of these societies. I mean, everyone's looking up and they're waiting to experience whatever this message is, but they're not conversing with each other. They're not communicating with each other. They're simply getting a message from an anonymous source. So we have this. So thought Septimus, looking up, they are signaling to me. Not indeed in actual words. That is, he could not read the language yet, but it was plain enough, this beauty, this exquisite beauty, and tears filled his eyes as he looked at the smoke words languishing and melting in the sky and bestowing upon him in their inexhaustible charity and laughing goodness one shape after another of unimaginable beauty, and signaling their intention to provide him for nothing, forever, for looking merely, with beauty, more beauty. Tears ran down his cheeks. It was toffee. They were advertising toffee, a nursemaid told Razzia. Together they began to spell it. So we have this incredibly beautiful and moving and very distressing, actually, feeling that Septimus Smith, life is sort of unbearable for him, whether it's a horror that he is seeing or whether it is beauty. And then we are brought down to earth with this very declarative sentence, it was toffee. And what's even more important is that is the voice of someone speaking to Razzia. So you have this idea of yet another voice being heard, in this case, a nursemaid who happens to be sitting near them. One very important thing that you as listeners are not probably, that you can't appreciate because you're listening, is the way that these sentences are punctuated. Stream of consciousness, of course, is known for very long sentences, very convoluted sentences. There are lots of semicolons happening here. There are lots of parentheses. I cannot get enough of the way that this woman punctuates things. It is so telling, and at times actually can be a little taxing on the reader, but you get caught up in these long phrases and these long accumulations of phrases with commas that really are feeling like they're doing something new with language. So if the idea of modernism is this idea of make it new, and if we're really digging into this idea of interiority, you can imagine the implications for that for writing about sexuality. You can also imagine if you're Virginia Woolf and you're someone who has been in love with both men and women, and has had physical experiences with both men and women, that you would really want to express that. But what's so impressive to me in many ways, and this happens with a number of different female characters that we see in Woolf, is she is giving all of these experiences and all of these thoughts and this very deep queerness to Clarissa Dalloway, who, from the title of the book, is this kind of example of marriage and the patriarchy. And one of the things that I like best about the passages about sexuality is her use of symbolism. You can imagine that if you want to describe someone's thoughts and you want to talk about their experience of thinking, one of the best ways to do that would be with analogy, because it's very hard to describe these things, like the emotional reactions and the sensations that people are experiencing. So she has beautiful use not only of symbolism, but also of metaphor, simile, all of that figurative language. So I want to take a look at a couple of different passages. The first have to do with Sally Seton, and then we're going to look at her rendezvous. I mean, that might be a bit strong, but we're going to look at her meeting, her brief meeting, when Peter Walsh comes over before her party. So importantly, all of this thinking that she is doing about her sexuality when she's an older woman, when she is 51 years old and preparing for her party, she's going upstairs to the room where she sleeps, which is up in the sort of attic area. So, and note all of these beautiful similes that we have at the beginning here. And note these two important similes that we have at the very beginning. Like a nun withdrawing or a child exploring a tower, she went upstairs, paused at the window, came to the bathroom. And then down a little further, she begins to think more explicitly about her relationship with Richard. She had failed him. She could not see what she lacked. It was not beauty. It was not mind. It was something central which permeated, something warm which broke up surfaces and rippled the cold contact of man and woman, or of women together. For that she could dimly perceive. She resented it. had a scruple picked up heaven knows where, or, as she felt, sent by nature, who was invariably wise. Yet she could not resist sometimes yielding to the charm of a woman. Then down a little further, she did undoubtedly then feel what men felt, only for a moment, but it was enough. It was a sudden revelation, a tinge like a blush which one tried to check, and then, as it spread, one yielded to its expansion and rushed to the farthest verge, and there quivered and felt the world come closer, swollen with some astonishing significance, some pressure of rapture, which split its thin skin and gushed and poured with an extraordinary alleviation over the cracks and sores. Then, for that moment, she had seen an illumination, a match burning in a crocus, an inner meaning almost expressed. But the close withdrew, the hard softened. It was over, the moment. So this is so beautiful. I mean, at the beginning, we have the idea of her as a nun or a child. And then we have this very confessional thing about, why it is that she feels that she has somehow failed her husband. But then very quickly, she moves into this idea of a very strong sense of sensuality and sexuality that she does experience. And then we move into this incredible metaphor, which is this passage is so sexual. The idea of things being swollen and gushing. And then this idea, a match burning in a crocus. You have this idea of really trying to describe something, that this yearning and this understanding about being attracted to another woman in the idea of sexual desire. But this idea of a match burning in a crocus, you have these beautiful things, matches, having to do with fire and passion and heat. And then the crocus, if you imagine it, maybe not like all the way open, they're like those blue flowers. And in some ways they are very kind of vaginal. I'm making like a weird, like vaginal shape with my hand actually. But we have this incredible mixture of what she is thinking. And then all of these attempts to really describe what these images and feelings that are moving through her are like. And for people who say that nothing is happening in Woolf, obviously these plot lines are very subtle, but if you're someone who's really interested in relationships between people, it is so rich. So I want to move on a little bit, and we get to, this is still in this passage where she is thinking about Sally Seaton, who she used to love. And the ways that Woolf is articulating these things that were experiences of Clarissa Dalloway, who was a conservative kind of matronly figure, are so bold. So this is when they were all gathered someplace when they were young together, where Sally went running naked down the hallway. So we have this on page 35. Then came the most exquisite moment of her whole life, passing a stone urn with flowers in it. Sally stopped, picked a flower, kissed her on the lips. It's so bold. The whole world might have turned upside down. The others disappeared. There she was alone with Sally, and she felt that she had been given a present, wrapped up, and told just to keep it, not to look at it. A diamond, something infinitely precious, wrapped up, which, as they walked, up and down, she uncovered. Or the radiance burst through, the revelation, the religious feeling, when old Joseph and Peter faced them. Stargazing, said Peter. It was like running one's face against a granite wall in the darkness. It was shocking. It was horrible. Incredible. We have this incredible pile up here, this idea of having given a present, but that sense of it being so precious that she doesn't even want to look at it. It's a diamond. It's wrapped up. It has enormous potential. This is something that you would look forward to, even though it's all imaginary. And then we have this idea of seeing Peter Walsh and him, minimizing everything they're going through by just simply saying, are they, stargazing. And this idea of it was like running into a granite wall. And it's not even just a granite wall, it's a granite wall in the darkness. And then she's so explicit. It was shocking. It was horrible. So we've taken kind of a close look at this whole interlude with Sally because there is so much in the book that is about opportunities not taken and about thinking back about things. We have these long passages that are so beautifully done. It's also amazing because we have this incredible sense of Sally, and then she shows up later and she's a mother of 5 boys. And in many ways, that's very disappointing to Clarissa Dalloway, obviously. But I want to finish this portion about the sexuality by looking at this meeting that she has with Peter Walsh. Peter Walsh actually has the audacity to pop by her house early, and she is sitting and she's mending this dress, and he comes into this very private domestic space where she is doing something very private and domestic. She wants to be resting. And they have this interaction that is so loaded and is one of the most incredible use of symbolism that I've ever read in my life. This is on page 40. The passage mentions a letter. Apparently he'd sent a letter about popping by and she had not read it. So on page 40, I'm going to pay special attention here to the symbolism. Heavens, the front doorbell, exclaimed Clarissa, staying her needle. Roused, she listened. So you need to think of the needle as our first phallic symbol. She herself, Mrs. Dalloway, has a needle. She essentially has her own phallus. And this idea of roused, we're really primed in many ways to see this as kind of a passionate exchange. And he kind of barges in past Lucy, who's kind of trying to gatekeep. And we have this. What can, asked Mrs. Dalloway, thinking it was outrageous to be interrupted at 11 o'clock on the morning of the day she was giving a party, hearing a step on the stairs. She heard a hand upon the door. She made to hide her dress, like a virgin protecting chastity, respecting privacy. So we're establishing here the dress as her virginity. So you can imagine the folds of the dress perhaps being very vaginal. Now the brass knob slipped. So here we have the idea of a knob. Now the door opened and in came. For a single second she could not remember what he was called. So surprised was she to see him. So glad, so shy, so utterly taken aback. To have Peter Walsh come to her unexpectedly in the morning. She had not read his letter. And how are you, said Peter Walsh, positively trembling, taking both her hands, kissing both her hands. She's grown older, he thought, sitting down. I shan't tell her anything about it, he thought, for she's grown older. So here we're in Peter's interiority. And again, it's not like someone's reporting to us, oh, he thought she looked older. It's you have this idea of surprise and the fact that he's having to repeat this to himself. She's grown older. She's looking at me, he thought, a sudden embarrassment coming over him, though he had kissed her hands. Putting his hand into his pocket, he took out a large pocket knife and half opened the blade. Which is so funny because this is, any kind of a knife is definitely a phallic symbol. He's putting his hand into his pocket and pulling out this knife, and then it is half opened. It is a large pocket knife, and then we're moving on. Exactly the same, thought Clarissa, the same queer look, the same check suit, a little out of the straight his face is, a little thinner, drier perhaps, but he looks awfully well and just the same. How heavenly it is to see you again, she exclaimed. He had his knife out. That is so like him, she thought. So she's even noticing, it's like this nervous thing that he is doing, but it's like he's trying to sort of lead with his masculinity. And then a little further down, and what's all this, he said, tilting his penknife toward the green dress. So here we have him literally pointing at things with his phallic symbol. He's very well dressed, thought Clarissa, yet he always criticizes me. Here she is mending her dress as usual, he thought. Here she's been sitting all the time I've been in India, mending her dress. Playing about, going to parties, running to the house and back and all that, he thought, growing more and more irritated, more and more agitated. For there's nothing in the world so bad for some women as marriage, he thought, and politics, and having a conservative husband, like the admirable Richard. So that whole passage is so steeped in jealousy and just defensiveness. And then it kind of culminates with this. So it is, he thought, shutting the knife with a snap. So here we have him just withdrawing. And right after he withdraws, sort of putting away his phallic symbol, then we have her saying, as soon as that happens, Richard's very well. Richard's at a committee, said Clarissa, and she opened her scissors. Incredible. So we have this idea of both of them being very vulnerable, but both of them also being fairly critical of one another, and everything having to do with passion and marriage. But you have this underlying thing of, she has her needle, he has his penknife, and then at the end she's opening scissors. I mean, she's really kind of like outdoing him by double. So this is the kind of analysis that you could do with any passage in here. You would have symbolism, and even within the passage, you have all of these different metaphors and beautiful ways of trying to describe these interior feelings and thoughts. It's just unbelievable. So I want to close today just by looking at the very end of the novel. I mean, it's actually kind of great because in a book like this, it's just there are not very many spoilers. I mean, there's going to be a party. There is actually a lot of action with what is happening with Septimus. But, the sort of culmination of this scene here is simply someone's appearance. And what I love about the end is we have a little bit of a focus on Elizabeth Dalloway. And I love a book that's sort of forward moving. I mean, this is a book, Clarissa Dalloway is 51 years old. All of this stuff about her being so elderly and gray. I mean, I guess maybe if she's looking very gray, didn't have quite the same salon options back then. But she does feel like someone who is really looking back over the course of her life and is really questioning her choices. And then we have Elizabeth, who is at the beginning of her adulthood and whose way is not at all clear, which in some ways is very exciting. So at the end, in this really beautiful fashion, we have everyone kind of coming together at the party in exactly the way that you might imagine they would. So on page 194, we have this. For her father had been looking at her as he stood talking to the Bradshaws, and he had thought to himself, who is that lovely girl? And suddenly he realized that it was his Elizabeth, and he had not recognized her. She looked so lovely in her pink frock. Elizabeth had felt him looking at her as she talked to Willie Titcomb. So she went to him and they stood together. Now that the party was almost over, looking at the people going and the rooms getting emptier and emptier, with things scattered on the floor. Even Ellie Henderson was going, nearly last of all, though no one had spoken to her. But she had wanted to see everything, to tell Edith. And Richard and Elizabeth were rather glad it was over, but Richard was proud of his daughter. Quick moment here, just to look that in this very brief section right here, we have entered into the minds and thoughts, and we've heard the actual words of so many people. We have Richard saying, like, who is that lovely girl? We have his thoughts verbatim. And a little further down, when we have Ellie Henderson about how she wanted to tell everything to Edith, this is a more minor character, but the way that Woolf is able, this is called free and direct discourse, when a narrator can move into the minds of all of these different people. And in many ways, this book seeks to be very democratizing. It's certainly about Clarissa Dalloway, who's like a society woman with her conservative husband, who's like in the government. But then we enter into the minds of lots of different people in a way that's very beautiful. And then we end up back, even in the middle of the paragraph, we are back with Richard and Elizabeth. So they're happy that things are over, but Richard was proud of his daughter. And he had not meant to tell her, but he could not help telling her. He looked at her, he said, and he had wondered, who is that lovely girl? And it was his daughter. That did make her happy. But the poor dog was howling. Oh my gosh, unbelievable. One of the things that Woolf does that I just find incredibly important, and it adds so much texture, is she can really take the air out of things. It's a bit like when we walk into the granite wall, or the thing about it was toffee. Here we have this really beautiful paragraph, and then we have, but her poor dog was howling. So it's important to Elizabeth that her poor dog is howling, but you have the sense of things being brought down right when her father is expressing this really beautiful thing about how proud he is of her. So we have the end where the dog is howling. And then at the bottom, we have this delightful symmetry where we have Sally Seaton. She was just so adventuresome when she was young, and now she's become a society woman. So she and Peter Walsh, who were, Clarissa's love interests when she was younger, the two of them are talking at the end here, and they're sort of assessing Richard. We've just had that beautiful paragraph about Richard and Elizabeth. Richard has improved. You are right, said Sally. I shall go and talk to him. I shall say good night. What does the brain matter, said Lady Rossiter, getting up, compared with the heart? I love that we're having her both as Sally and Lady Rossiter. It's very much like Mrs. Dalloway and Clarissa. Everyone contains multitudes. I will come, said Peter, but he sat on for a moment. What is this terror? What is this ecstasy, he thought to himself. What is it that fills me with extraordinary excitement? It is Clarissa, he said, for there she was. So beautiful. So beautiful. I am just going to let that stand. This has been a relatively specific dive into Mrs. Dalloway, but I think in many ways that's one of the best ways to approach her work is to look at things on a much smaller level instead of trying to talk about them broadly. Clearly, I find this work very, very moving. It is so complex and so rich, and I hope that today has given you a little better sense of why it's very important for us to be celebrating the 100th anniversary of this book and the 151st birthday of Clarissa Dalloway. Thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.